So, hello and welcome to the latest in the Leaders with Ambition podcast series. And today I'm absolutely delighted to welcome my guest, Christian Gavin, who's partner at ABG Corporate Finance. And it's going to be a really interesting conversation today, which will see Christian starting his career at university and deciding that actually he wanted to earn some money quicker. So he made the decision to drop out of university and decided that a career in accountancy would be the one that would set him up for the rest of his life. And he managed to get a role at BDO at a time when they actually only took people on with degrees. So I think there was some great sales techniques going on there from Christian. Also, then the next iteration of his career, where he moved into corporate finance and decided from day one that this was his home and he had a big passion for corporate finance. He'll talk us through that and also some of the career highlights and lowlights. And, during Christian's career, we've had the GFC, we've had Brexit, and we've had COVID. So there's lots to unpick and talk about coping strategies, about how we can actually work towards overcoming stressful and challenging situations. And the subsequent decision that Christian made to then join his now co-partner, Eleanor Wilkinson, who'd founded ABG. And I think the really interesting thing I found when I met with Christian and talked about his career was he took a sabbatical as part of his recent iteration in his career. And what a brave decision that was. And also how amazing, because it gave him the opportunity to really reconnect with his family in what is a very stressful job in corporate finance. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Christian, who is going to bring his career history to life for us. So Christian, over to you.
Hi, Nikki. Thanks ever so much. And thank you for the summary. I'm not sure if this is somewhere between a therapy session or an episode of This Is Your Life, but I'm not sure we would fill a complete half-hour program if it was on telly. But no, thank you for that. As you said, I mean, my sort of early years were pretty stock standard, really. I grew up in South London, went to the local state schools, went to what historically had been a grammar school. It was a slight anachronism. It's actually a 400-year-old school, but which is a state school, probably all the airs and graces of a private school, but thankfully for my parents, without the invoice that comes quarterly. And it was a fairly normal expectation that you would go through the flight path of GCSEs, A-level, university, and then on to some sort of professional career. I managed to make it most of the way through that, or at least all the way through to university. But as you say, that's the point at which it took a slight detour for us.
From a young age, you'd actually worked yourself, hadn't you? You'd always been very focused on providing and supporting yourself financially. You had a couple of jobs when you were quite young.
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily. I wouldn't want to overplay it and describe it as supporting myself financially. I was definitely on the parental wallet when it came to that sort of stuff. But yeah, there's always been a fairly strong work ethic within my family, and a sense of purpose has been important within that. Saturday jobs were kind of an important feature of it, not just in terms of the opportunity to get out into the world, to see a little bit more of it, to interact with people outside of the school teacher setting, but also the opportunity to earn and to develop that agency and that personal independence around saying, this is my money, I earned it, I have a right to make decisions about my life, and the pride that comes with that. So classic sort of schoolboy Saturday jobs in sort of local newsagents and those sorts of things, and summer jobs, including once I remember working for the now historic Encyclopedia Britannica, which sort of ages me, I'm afraid, remembering those sorts of things. But for the older readers amongst you, you'll remember that used to be a periodical that everyone had in their house and was normally sold in massive volumes. I was there just as it was going online and going digital, and I was part of their customer service and then their IT team. So there was a bit of do whatever you can to earn a few quid when you're a student, which is fairly common fare, I think. I don't know if that's the same way that people do it these days, but hopefully so.
To get jobs now for younger people, actually, particularly before they hit the ages of 16 and 17. So, it's not. I can't imagine many people dragging newspapers around anymore. It's the print media anymore. I don't know.
I mean, it's a long time since I've seen a paper boy or a paper girl. Certainly, I don't think anyone is going to start throwing iPads across the front lawn in my area. Everything comes on the phone these days, so why would you need them? But you're right. I think that that landscape has changed for young people working, and I think that's something that we're seeing in the employment environment as well, and in the professional space, as people, they have developed differently. Their expectations of their early years are very different now to what mine were going back, 30 odd years, I suppose now.
Different way of learning, isn't it?
Yeah, indeed.
So you decided that you were going to become an accountant. Why was that?
Yeah, I did. So, I wanted to be various things in the course of my life. Originally, I'd actually wanted to be an engineer. So I'm very much a sort of frustrated engineer wannabe who didn't quite make it. Turns out you need to be much better at maths than I am to be an engineer.
Or an accountant, I would say then.
Possibly. Yeah, I mean, thankfully for me, there are things like calculators and Excel, which always cover a multitude of sins. Now, I wanted to be an engineer, like my father, amongst a number of other things I probably wanted to do when I was growing up, but it became quite clear that wasn't a route that was going to work for me. That wasn't a career path that was likely to yield in success. I'd actually done some work experience when I was at school at a local accountancy firm, and that was I think the standard 1 week of work experience that you're expected to do when you're 16, which I think still happens. I'd found a local accountancy firm, and that seemed to be quite a good fun week. And I noticed that you don't tend to see many poor accountants in the world, so I'd always had it in the back of my mind that it wasn't a bad career. In fact, it offered quite a lot of transferable skills, and it was a good way to be able to transport yourself around the world if you needed to. So it was definitely in the back of my mind. But yeah, and as I looked forward into universities and what that might offer, I ended up originally thinking about an accountancy degree, but then kind of flaked out on that at the last minute and said, actually, I want to see if I can do something with a bit of an engineering bent. So I ended up going in to do, I think it was called technology management, which I think looking back on it now was probably neither fish nor fowl. You were not really the property of the business department, of business faculty, and you weren't really the property of the engineering faculty. You just kept bouncing between the two. This was the days of New Labour and Tony Blair and trying to get 50% of young people into university. So I suspect there was quite a lot of explosion in the number and range of courses without a great amount of forethought as to what the career prospects were going to offer. But as you said, fairly quickly, I identified that being at university, for a host of reasons, didn't really suit me. It didn't work very well for me. I wasn't enjoying being away from home for the first time in life. And it was Portsmouth University. It was a very lovely place. I loved Portsmouth as a city, but the independence was something that I probably struggled with a bit more than I expected. I definitely didn't like not having money, which gave me the choices that I wanted to be able to make. And I think I was struggling to adapt to the new way of working. That shift from A-levels at school to independent learning at university was a bit of a crunching of the gears for me. And so I decided by the end of the first term at Christmas, when I went back home to see the family at Christmas, that this was going well, but thanks, I'm done. I'm out of here, which obviously was quite a difficult message to explain to your parents who've supported you all that way. And I think from my point of view, probably added to it was the difficulty that I was the first person in my family to go to university proper. And so I think I felt an extra sense of burden and responsibility around that. I'm not sure that's a burden that my parents would have wished me to feel, but I certainly did feel it and have a sense of that still to this day. But they took it very well. They were very supportive. Between us, both sides, we'd identified that if I wasn't going to go to university, I needed to have some sort of plan for life. And I looked at accountancy still as an option, and I thought, well, go back to basics. I'm going to need something that will offer me a long-term prospect. Accountancy is a good transferable skill. It's something that you can take into a number of different industries, so you don't have to be an accountant, but being financially literate is rarely a bad thing. And actually, it was an opportunity to stay living at home whilst working, to earn a bit of money, try and keep learning, find out what I wanted to do with my life, and essentially keep moving forwards whilst not setting anything in stone. So it seemed like a fairly decent option for me.
And BDO was the company that you approached as well, wasn't it?
Yeah, in many respects, I was very fortunate. It was one of a number of lucky turns I've had in my career and in my life, and I'd love to say it was all part of a carefully calculated and executed strategy. But no, I was looking at a number of very much local accountancy firms, the sort of a few accountants above the video shop in the village high street types. When an agency who I was talking to had said BDO Stoy Hayward, as it was then, down in one of their offices in Surrey, had a need for somebody, and I went to go for an interview. And was lucky to be given the job. I don't think there was no secret about the fact that BDO were predominantly, if not entirely, a graduate employer. So I was a little bit of an oddity, I think, in terms of what they were expecting, what they were used to. But I was given 6 months on a non-training contract, effectively as an extended probation period. And so having started in the February, the summer rolled around and they decided that actually I was worth hanging on to. So they gave me a formal training contract for the usual 3 years.
That's so good. And you must have worked really hard to achieve that as well, because, you're thrust into somewhere. You're obviously younger than most people that are actually starting because they've got the degree behind them as well. So, you obviously put a lot of time, effort and energy into making it work. Or did you not?
I like to think that that's the root of the success. I worked out quite quickly that without a formal training contract, I was vulnerable, and the best defence that I had in terms of getting that training contract was to make myself, if not indispensable, at least incredibly useful. And so I had to work really, really hard. So knuckled down for 6 months. Looking back on it, I hate to think what it was like for many of the people working in that office, suddenly having this sort of 18-year-old rock up with all of the various rough edges that 18-year-olds come to in the workplace. They were used to slightly smoother and more sophisticated individuals who've gone through the university experience and the maturity of the extra 3 years that gives you. So I was very fortunate that they were accommodating and they were very cooperative about that.
But yeah, supportive environment as well, didn't you? And I think that's amazing to think of obviously the partner that was there at the time, and everybody made it one of those the culture led the firm at the time, didn't it? And it was.
I would say it was at a time where within the larger firms you still had localized offices which were of a scale where you had a matriarchal figure within the offices. You had a patriarchal figure within the offices, and they had a very family feel to them. But that wasn't always an easy experience, because sometimes it felt like you were living with two families. You had your own and then you had the other one at work. But there was a strong sense of caring about the individuals who worked at those firms, who worked in those offices. And I think it's interesting that with the development of a greater sense of sort of moral duty of care and ethical standards in the modern work environment, I do worry that sometimes those more basic, empathetic, familial aspects of culture have been replaced by a more corporate, regimented approach. And I'm not sure that's always for the positive. So, I was very fortunate to have still been in the early years of my career when you did have, the office mum who looked after you and would throw an arm around your shoulder if you didn't look like you're having a particularly good day.
Right time, right place.
Something like that.
And so you started to build your career there, didn't you? You learned a lot, and it was, I think, one of those places that you said you learned networking, you learned how to work in a professional environment.
Yes, I mean, this was obviously in the days still when you actually went out on site to do audits, and you had to turn up with massive flight cases full of paper files. In fact, I saw someone on the train the other day with an old-fashioned flight case, and I thought, gosh, it must be 25 years since I've seen one of those. You would turn up mob-handed with a bunch of young people, an enormous collection of paper files, and you would plonked on the corner office, with some scruffy desk, and you were made to go and, here's the cash and bank section, go and talk to whoever, Ted or Margaret, who runs the cash book, and go and ask them some questions. You'd never met Ted or Margaret before, or whoever it was, and they'd never met you, and probably they weren't particularly interested, but you had to go and get some information out of them, and that meant you had to learn to butter them up and make sure that it was in their interest to try and help you out. And so that ability to develop relationships with people quite quickly was something that you really needed to develop at speed. I'm not sure that it was always my strongest suit, but I certainly managed to develop enough to get by during the earlier part of my career, that's for sure.
Great life skills to build.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, at the risk of sounding like it was better in the old days and all that sort of stuff, we can all see across the modern economy and professional services that the primacy of email communication and data and software-led communication, whether it's Teams, Slack, whatever it is, that has fundamentally shifted the nature of interpersonal communications. And I think that's a transition that different generations are struggling with, and which sometimes business leaders today look back on ruefully and wish that it was still how it was in the past, even though that was it was a much more slow-paced and sometimes more expensive way of doing things. It did have a more enduring relationship building capacity to it. And I think that's part of the challenge of, not just the digitalization of communications between professionals, but it's also one of the impacts of remote working. You don't have that relationship building opportunity in the same way if you're now 25 or 22 compared to how it is now. And if you're leading a business full of people of that age, you have to be mindful and cognizant of the fact that it is different today. You can't expect the same things of the younger generation when their world is very different from the world that I lived in at their age.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point. And the interesting thing with professional services firms is it's about people, isn't it? That's
fundamentally, yes.
Yeah. So it does help to have those social skills as well. So when you started to build your career there, at what stage did you think, yes, this is my career now? You'd obviously had the interest in accountancy from a younger age. You started to do your role now. When did it all start to click for you?
Well, I can tell you my exam record and the retakes I took will definitely tell you there was no point at which it all absolutely clicked, I'm afraid. I think likewise, I'm afraid there wasn't a defining moment where I thought, that's it, this is for me. I think it was very much a sort of deepening relationship where I realized that actually I quite enjoyed this. There was a lot to be had out of it. It gave me an opportunity to meet a lot of different types of businesses. I'm an annoyingly and inveterately curious person. I like to understand how things work, and it goes back to that engineering part of my brain that didn't get quite satisfied in the career. And that gave me an opportunity to really stretch that part of the cerebral muscle. And that was very much a decent means to an end in that respect. The chance to do the same job day in, day out probably would never have worked for me. The chance to do fundamentally the same sorts of things, but with very different groups of people from week to week, month to month, that really provided the variety that I was looking for in my career, and was the reason why I think I not so much fell in love with it, but just kind of developed an enduring bond with it.
I love that, an enduring bond. And then you decided to move. You wanted to get a bit more rounded experience because you were doing mainly not-for-profit, weren't you?
I was, yeah. It was and it was a specialist centre within the firm that I was working at. It was one of the, genuinely say, I think it was one of the best teams in the country that was doing that sort of work, and had some of the best and most exciting clients we were working with, and some really, really great people. But I was also conscious that it was a firm that I joined when I was particularly young. And in that sense, I'd seen relatively little of the wider profession and the wider world. And I felt it was time to pack up my things in a knapsack and head off to pastures new. I liked working in the charity and not-for-profit sector. I know that's not everybody's passion and experience. In fact, lots of people still to this day will say they don't want to be involved in the not-for-profit sector. It's poor recoveries, it's dull, it's uninspiring, etc. Actually, I always found that it was what you make of it, and there was a lot to get in amongst. Yeah, very much so. I mean, again, the variety was high, the quality of the people was high, and the genuine enthusiasm they had for the work they did, I found to be quite infectious. I'm not saying that people who run, standard manufacturing SMEs are not enthused about what they do for a living, but I just happened to find that there was a higher proportion of people who, when they went to work for a charity or a school or other not-for-profit, a high proportion of those people went there because they were genuinely besotted with what they did and what their organisation did, and that couldn't help but rub off on me. So yeah, I ended up going across to one of the other mid-tier accounting firms, which was in those days called Horwath Clark Whitehill, and I went there as an audit manager within their not-for-profit team. But that sadly wasn't a long-term experience. I think it was something which taught me the value of due diligence. In absolute fairness to them, I had failed to ask the right questions about them as a firm, about their structure, their strategy, and the way in which they operated. And what I found was a situation which didn't work for me. And I think that became reasonably clear reasonably quickly. And so I decided that I would give it a good period of time to really see if I was just making a knee-jerk assumption and reaction to it, or actually whether this was something that I needed to just knuckle down and get on with it, and the solution would find itself and it would all right out. But equally, I was mindful that you do sometimes have to acknowledge you're in a situation that isn't right for you. It's not right for the employer that you're working for. You both need to cut your losses and move on. And that's ultimately what took me away from audit and throwing my career and everything else up into the sky and seeing where it landed. And it landed in a completely different county from where I'd grown up, and in a completely different area of the profession in corporate finance.
But from day one, you loved it.
Absolutely adored it. Yeah, some people will say this is sick and twisted, but I couldn't see the downside. I couldn't see why you wouldn't enjoy it. It was, and has always been, enormously interesting to me in terms of your ability to meet new people, to get into conversations which are more than just functional. They are strategic in their nature. It has given me the opportunity to become obsessive compulsive about detail, then to get in a helicopter and fly up to 50,000 feet and talk about macro market directions of travel, strategy. It's allowed me to really get into and under the skin of people's psyche and what motivates them. It's a room with 1,000 doors off of it, and I've barely got past about 150 of them so far, and I've got a long time left to go.
I love that. So when you started to work in that environment, did you have to have lots of training, or were you just thrown in and kind of sink or swim environment?
So this was the early 2000s, and obviously you mentioned that various things that had befallen me from a market perspective during my career, including GFC, Brexit, COVID. We also had the dot-com boom bust in around kind of 2000. So if you're not careful, you'd be forgiven for saying that I'm probably a jinx in the market so far. Bad things happen when I'm at work. I think in the immediate aftermath, obviously there was turmoil in financial markets, but by around kind of 2002, 2003, that had bounced back, and there was a rapid acceleration in the pace and the volume of M&A. The bigger firms were looking to gear up quite substantially, and they were looking to suck talent as quickly as they could from wherever they could. And so for people like me, who were, we were qualified accountants, not necessarily from a banking background, but clearly numerate, literate, understood what it was to be in the world of work, had risen somewhere up the career tree. We had something to offer, even if it was only blood, sweat, toil and tears. So I was, again, very fortunate. I joined KPMG Corporate Finance, and this was back in, I think, 2003. So I joined KPMG Corporate Finance, and it was at a time when they still spent huge amounts of money on training for their newer members of staff within the corporate finance and consulting teams. I don't know, maybe they still do, but we certainly enjoyed a very old-fashioned in-house sort of business school approach to the training, and that was a fantastic opportunity. It really was. It was a chance to really get into the technical nuts and bolts of what it is to be involved in the capital markets, but also a chance to develop some networks and people who I'm still in contact with today, not least of all of my business partner, who I first met on the first training courses we ever went to as part of KPMG's CF training program.
I love that. That's great, isn't it? And it's interesting, I think, when you are training and in that environment with people and you're working so hard, aren't you? Putting so many hours in, you do get pretty close pretty quickly to people, because that's the only network that you're seeing, isn't it?
Yeah, and it nearly didn't happen, actually. I having originally decided to leave audit, I was looking to move into sort of the for-profit and financial services side of the profession. And it was a bit of a toss of a coin between whether I joined KPMG Corporate Finance or took another job, which I'd been offered, which was at Lehman Brothers, actually, involved in some of their mid-office for their hedge fund activities. And I was just about to sign on the contract when I realized that actually despite having made it through all the interview rounds, in my heart and in my bones, I didn't really know what it was and how they were doing it. And this was all to do with CDO trading of sort of debt instruments. Now, as we all found out a few years later, unfortunately, they didn't know what they were doing either. I'd love to say that was my great intelligence and prescience. It was, I think I just realized that if I don't really understand what it is they're doing, I won't probably last very long, and I'll be looking for another job within 6 months. But I felt more confident and more comfortable within corporate finance. And so that was the direction in which I went. And it's proven to be a wise decision, if not one made in the most auspicious of circumstances.
And do you think that not having a degree has held you back at all? Because it doesn't sound like it has in any way, shape or form.
No, I'm not sure that's true, actually. And my eldest son is about to take his GCSEs this year. And so we're in the midst of this whole conversation as a family about the decisions you make in terms of academic life and what those do and don't mean for career and life prospects. It would be wrong to say that it hasn't held me back. It would be wrong to say that it's absolutely stymied my career equally. I mean, there were definitely some moments where I might have applied for a job only to be told, no, you won't get a first round interview because they don't accept non-graduates. And this was long since after I was a qualified accountant, chartered accountant. So at a point at which I thought I might not have stamped that part of my dance card, but that no longer mattered. Apparently, it did still matter to a number of employers. I would describe myself as having gone the long way around the curve on a number of occasions as a result of not having a degree. I think there are some benefits to it. I think it has given me a strong appreciation for how hard some people have to work when their career doesn't take a turn that they expected. And that certainly reflects my journey. But I think it also made me understand how grateful I needed to be to a number of the people who, as I said earlier, helped to rub some of the rough edges off me when I was first entering the workplace.
That's it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think, more and more, particularly at the time when you were coming through education, everyone had to go to university, as you say. It was really encouraged, wasn't it? It was almost pushed onto people. And I think now it costs so much money. And, some people are getting into a considerable amount of debt, and it's not going to further their education, their careers. So it's something that has to be viewed really carefully now. But at the time, it really was rammed down your throat, wasn't it?
Yeah, and I think it's a really interesting time from an educational and employer's perspective as well, because as we know, the things which employers need are not always the things which the educational establishment are expert at providing to people. And I think often the careers advice, despite being well-meaning, it is functionally quite out of date. And that's a source of, I think, great irritation to people running businesses in this country, and probably also to the young people who are receiving that advice, because they go along with a particular narrative and find out that the world is not quite that way. A great example of that would be, in the traditional accountancy profession. It's undergoing some of the most seismic change in terms of the capital structure and the corporate structure of the mid-market firms and the larger firms. Probably the largest change that's happened for a couple of generations. And yet I suspect that most of the people who are in universities are fairly unaware about the implications of that. The movement towards consolidation backed by private equity has got profound changes for the long-term prospects of people entering the accountancy profession and what that might or might not mean for them in terms of income and capital appreciation over the next 20, 30, 40 years of their life. And I think also, in the wider world, you're right, people who enter a workforce with £60,000 plus of debt have a very different experience and expectation of a job when they're seeing it as part of a transactional relationship. And I think the university experience itself has become much more transactional. I certainly know if I was, 18 to 21 years old and I was spending £20,000 a year on my education, and I knew I personally was going to have to pay that back, my expectations of that would be fundamentally different to if I felt I was getting it paid for by the state and I'd be returning the favour in the form of future taxation on my earnings. I think it's a very different set of motivations for people as well. Younger people are being asked to think about their long-term career prospects at a much younger age. And I think that's very difficult because often they don't know, and it's not necessarily right that they should know. I was thinking about this with someone a few weeks ago. If you, in round numbers terms admittedly, but if you expect someone to tip out of formal educational establishments at roughly 20 years old and roughly 70 years old, they'll be retiring, looking at current life expectancies. You've got 50 years in which somebody can expect to be in full and productive employment. Well, actually, within that, you could have 5 completely different and distinct careers of 10 years each. It's not really a surprise, therefore, that younger people going through the gears on that will say, I don't want to stay in one particular job for 5, 6 or 7 years, because they've only got 10 within the bookends of that career phase from their perspective. And when we as employers and business leaders are looking at why people are flaky, snowflakes, fly-by-nights, moonlighters, whatever you want to call it, they're jumping ship every 18 months, every 2 years. That's because they're on a mission. They're in a hurry, being surprised about that. I think both sides need to rationalize and better communicate their expectations. Otherwise, we're going to find a situation where the wrong things are being incentivized between employers and employees, and the wrong things are being rewarded.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think, as you say, people coming through university now, the jobs that they're going to be doing, or the jobs that people are going to be doing from young school age, haven't even been created or invented yet. So, it's very difficult to say this is what I'm going to do unless it's down a professional line, like a doctor, a lawyer, a teacher, or something that's quite clear cut. It's so different now.
But even then, the impact of technology on those industries is going to be fundamental. As you say, a lot of the jobs don't simply exist at the moment. To go back through even my lifetime, the fall in the popularity of modern foreign languages within modern education reflects the fact that technology has allowed people to communicate across multiple languages in real time through technology. They simply don't need modern foreign language fluency in the individual, beset in the human, in the way that they once did. For $100, I can get myself a set of headphones that, with a Google app, will translate 40 foreign languages for me real time. Why do I need to spend 7 years plus learning French, German, Spanish, Finnish, whatever it may be? I can solve for that with $100.
Yeah, it's such a good point. And it's interesting, I do some mentoring at school, and the younger children, so I'm talking 12, 13, come and we talk about what would you like to be, what's your career aspirations, and they want to be social media influencers or footballers. Now, the reality of either of those things being achieved is very, very slim. But again, there's not that connection in what can you actually do, and goes back to your point there about some of the advice that they're given at schools. There isn't that whole range of it, and there are all these different options now. So I think there's going to be, or needs to be, a lot of change over the next few years, and the next generation will have an even bigger challenge. I think you're completely correct. So taking you back to KPMG, you were at KPMG when there was the GFC. How was it for you then? It must have just been.
Sorry, Nikki, I was actually at Livingstone with the GFC.
Ah, right, okay. So you were at Livingstone when the GFC happened.
Yes.
How was it for you?
In one word, hell. Yeah. In 2 words, absolute hell. I think for everybody in the mid-market, it was a really difficult time, set in the context of uncertainty. There were some really interesting questions to be asked, to which none of us had any great answers, such as what's going to happen with the capital markets? Will the stock market collapse? Will banking collapse? Will capitalism collapse? Will the world need corporate financiers in the same way? They sound quite apocalyptic questions, almost daft to pose them now, but I would put it in the same frame as when we were sat there in March, April and May 2020 and asking questions like, will humanity survive? Will the human race continue? Things which now seem almost preposterous at the time. You simply didn't have a complete answer to them. From a personal perspective, it was there's no good time for a global financial crisis, I'm sure, but it probably wasn't helped by the fact that our first child was about to be born in May 2008. So going into the teeth of a global financial crisis and the difficulty of what that meant for our income was probably not an ideal time to be facing that. Yeah. That was a challenging moment in life, that's for sure.
So how many challenges do you want on your plate at the same time, isn't it? Just add them all on.
Yeah, and I think it's, as I look back on it now from the perspective of somebody who runs a business and employs people, I wouldn't want to change places with those people. I think there were a lot of difficult decisions that had to be made. I think that a number of those had difficult implications for the people involved. We had to, defer our bonuses, which we had worked incredibly hard to earn, and a lot of us had expected and relied upon that cash flow coming in. We then had to take a 35% pay cut, which, as I say, when you're staring down the barrel of your wife being on maternity leave and you've got your first child coming along, that was a fairly sobering moment to have to go home and talk about that. That's for sure.
And when you decided that, you took your sabbatical, it was just around that time, wasn't it, that you took your sabbatical?
So I took a sabbatical in early 2014. I'd got to a point in life and career where the markets had started and restarted after the GFC. And then we got to a place where it was going better and it was likely to get a fair amount better shortly thereafter. But it had been difficult times. A number of us had worked incredibly hard to keep hustling, ducking and diving, bobbing and weaving, working ourselves really hard to make sure that we kept our businesses going and that the markets were offering us plenty of opportunity. By that point in late 2013, I'd got 3 children, all my 3 children, and I think I was very conscious that there was a risk that the market was going to become even busier and I would disappear even further into the workplace just at the time when the opportunity to meet and see my children grow up was going to go past me. And I was very mindful of the advice that had been given me by a great number of people whom I respected, who had been business leaders, who, if I ever talked to them about children, and particularly if as and when we were having the next one, they would all stare in a sort of 1,000-yard fashion at me and say, spend time with them when they're young. It goes past in the blink of an eye. And I remember thinking, you feel like somebody who's telling me that because you'd heard that yourself and yet you'd failed to heed the advice. So maybe if I only take one thing from you, it's that one and I'm going to execute on it. I think I was also very swayed by the fact that I was always incredibly impressed by people who demonstrated two really important character traits. One of them was that they recognized that the definition of success in life wasn't limited to the size of your bank balance or the size of your house. It involved things like the quality of your family relationships, still being with somebody you love and who loves you, having people who want to be around you and who enjoy your company. And the second thing I liked about those people was that they showed the personal bravery and courage to take difficult decisions to support that first aim. They were prepared to do things in support of that wider definition of success in their life, which to many people would seem illogical. And that was what took me to the decision to take a sabbatical and spend 6 months basically seeing what my wife and children looked like in the daylight. I'm not sure they necessarily enjoyed the experience quite as much as I did, but it was certainly something that I was very grateful to the partners at Livingstone for having allowed me to take. It was not cost-free financially, but also in career terms. I knew that it was likely to have a negative impact on my career. Other people, quite rightly, would expect to be advancing at a time when I was going to be standing still in my career. But I reckoned that over the wider perspective of my life, it would be an investment that would pay off. And I will always say that it's been something that has done that. It's something that I will never regret having done.
I love that. I still think it's a really brave decision because, as you say, you are in a situation. We've come out of the GFC. Things are starting to build again. Your career's building. It's a really brave decision to make, and as you say, the right decision definitely for you because it helped you reconnect with your family, and it also led to then your decision to be where you are today.
Yes, it did. So just patching back into something I talked about earlier with meeting people at KPMG Corporate Finance, I bumped into somebody in one of the earlier courses there who I found to be incredibly bright, annoyingly so sometimes. And if I looked around the room, and I was a bit of a try hard in those courses, this was the days of, work hard, play hard, and play hard generally meant drink hard. I wasn't so good at that, but I thought I'd make up for it by trying to work hard. But there was this one lady who was always able to come up with better answers than me, faster than me. And I used to find that so irritating, incredibly impressive, but also just a little bit irritating. And I thought, well, if you can't beat them, join them. And so we ended up becoming good friends whilst we were at KPMG. We then moved at the same time over to Livingstone Partners, where one of our previous directors had moved to by that point. Now, she had left at around the time that I went to take my sabbatical, and she had set up her own corporate finance boutique. And during the course of our sabbatical, we went out as friends, caught up on what my plans were in life. And after I had decided that actually I wasn't going to be going back to my previous firm, she said, well, look, I've started to get some traction here. Let's get the band back together. And so later on in 2014, that's exactly what we did. And I joined as the second partner at ABG Corporate Finance, where I remain to this day.
And you have been a massive part, both of you together have built a really strong culture, haven't you? I know you and I have talked about the culture of your firm before, and it feels different. How hard has that been? Was that both of you deciding from, this is what we're going to do, we're going to make sure this is the way that we run the firm? Has it happened organically?
Again, I'd love to say we had this wonderful master plan and strategy that we executed on brilliantly. That would be a lie.
Okay, let's do that.
What we yeah, everyone's a genius looking in the rearview mirror. I think we started from two fairly simple premises. One of them was that we wanted to make sure we were doing the deals. This was not an exercise in trying to build a firm that was a monolith or an edifice to our ambition, where we were sat atop a group of people who were doing the actual work. Our founding principle was we actually like doing the deals, and that's what we wanted to be doing. We wanted to be in the thick of it with the entrepreneurs, with the owner managers, with the investors, and therefore it was core to what we wanted to set up. The second part was that we wanted to have a firm where we delivered a great result for our clients. And if we got to the point where we ended up employing any people as part of our team, we wanted to deliver a great experience for them as well, because we all work for the firm. Ella and I happen to own the firm, but we work for it just as much as everybody else. And nobody works for anybody as an individual. We all work together in the team. There isn't a he reports to me, I report to him attitude to it, because in our experience, that's just not particularly helpful. Now, I know that's going to be very different once you scale that up, and that wouldn't be appropriate for others. But for us, it was much more about setting up that kind of culture from the get-go.
I love that. And do you find it difficult to continue that, though? Because it's, you've been operating for a few years now, and you've taken on people and you've grown the firm. How are you able to make sure that's in your water to continue for everyone to feel like that?
I think a lot of it is about how we conduct ourselves. So there's a genuine lead by example aspect to that. If we're not living the values that we espouse, then we've got a real problem. I think the second part of it is about making sure that we are picking people to be part of that team who fit. Now, that's not the same as picking identikits. We're not in the robot manufacturing business. What we want is a diversity of opinion. We want a diversity of personality, but we all need to share in some core values. And if there is a misalignment about those core values, that's going to be felt really badly across the team, and that's going to jar particularly. So we have to be really clear about what represents a good fit for us and where we represent a good fit for the individual. And that has on occasions meant that some really good people haven't been able to join us because either we thought they just wouldn't fit with the team, or actually we might not be the best thing for them in their career. And we didn't want people to join us as a firm and then discover that actually we weren't what they needed.
I think that's great. You've got to follow through on the way that you're creating the firm and make sure that it continues, haven't you? I think it's a really strong way of thinking about it. So you obviously had personal impact to join GFC, and then we move into Brexit and towards COVID, and you have your own firm. How is that?
Yes. The Brexit, the gift that keeps on giving.
We you'd be over now, didn't you? But gosh, as you say, the gift that keeps giving. Yeah.
So there we were, a few years in building the firm, and Brexit came along, and we were as surprised as a lot of people were that the vote went the way it did. That was a particularly dark morning. The next morning, we were We were into exclusivity and nearly completing on a couple of different transactions. One of them actually was probably about 2 or 3 days away from completion. The buyer had even printed the leaflets for all the staff at the target to say, welcome to your new employer. And I got a call from the strategy director at the then large listed business that was buying my client and said, look, you know what this conversation is going to go like. We don't know what the world now means for us. Everything is on hold. I'm really sorry, deal's off. And that was that. But you dust yourself down and you move on. Our client had engaged us to do a job, which was to advise on the right exit solution. And we couldn't sit there and cry about it. We had to go and do our jobs. And that meant going and finding another buyer. And we found them in a different part of the world. We found them in the US rather than found them in the UK. But we got on and did what we were paid to do.
There's not much of a better way than doing it than that, is there?
Well, as I say, the alternative was to sit there and cry about it, and I didn't think that was going to get us particularly far. So we didn't really think, all paid, but it was certainly not delivering what our client needed, and that is what we're in the business of. And then, as you say, a couple of years on, we sort of navigated through that, and I would say pleasantly surprised by the extent to which Brexit didn't have quite the calamitous effect on our business that we had perhaps foreseen. I'm not making a sort of political stance about that. It's just the reality of the market, as we've all seen. And then, we came round to COVID, and it was like a Groundhog Day, really. We were in deep, late discussions on various different transactions. And then the fateful day in March 2020 came along. We'd all of us seen, I think, the writing on the wall in terms of what the UK's likely response was going to be. We've done a fair bit in the healthcare sector over the years, so we also benefited as a firm from having a number of people who are in and around the healthcare community who were sharing certain whispers and rumours that said, yeah, this looks like this is going to be quite difficult. You should probably brace. And as a small firm, we knew that was going to be potentially pretty disastrous for us. We took the preparations we could, so we moved very quickly to get ourselves into a remote working situation. I think it took about 45 minutes in the end between when somebody called it and said, right, let's pack up, let's go home and don't know when we're going to come to the office again, and when all the phones were diverted, all the IT was fully set up, everybody had the webcams, everything was ready, and off we went. But the first couple of weeks was pretty scary. A number of transactions fell over and nobody quite knew what the future looked like. But we've always run the business with what most accountants would call quite a lazy balance sheet. We knew from the experience of the GFC, having not been partners in our firm Livingstone, but having seen how the balance sheet comes under pressure in those times, we'd always kept a very strong reserve in terms of our own balance sheet. So we knew that we got quite a lot of gas in the tank. We also, again, stuck to our core principles, which is go out and delight clients, make sure that they're getting what they need, look after your people. We, like everybody else, did the usual, remote Friday drinks on Zoom, which now if I think back to it, is slightly odd because it's basically a bunch of people sitting in a room on their own getting drunk in front of a webcam, which sounds like a very niche bit of YouTube. But we did whatever we could to try and keep people feeling human and to feel part of the team. And that was definitely a very steep learning curve at a time where, of course, we're all also feeling personally quite vulnerable as well. We've all got family members, older family members, younger family members, worrying about them, wondering what this means. And you've got to worry about cash flow and you've got members of your team you need to think about. It was a lot to have on our plate. But we were very lucky that the folks we had on our team were really sensible. They were really level-headed, and they definitely worked with us at that point rather than shrinking back into their shells.
Which is, again, it shows the culture that you developed and the way that you had the company structured, which was enabled that pivot to happen so quickly, which is great. So what do you think are the challenges at the moment then within corporate finance and for you and Eleanor running a firm, a corporate finance firm?
I think the obvious challenge is that it's a more difficult market environment at the moment. The cost of capital has risen. We've had a correction about the valuation and the pricing of risk in the economy, and that level of uncertainty, both economically and also if you look ahead for the next 12 months politically, makes that a difficult environment in which to try and execute transactions. But I don't think that's particularly difficult to how it's been on many occasions throughout our careers. And again, the panic response is not a really helpful one. What you have to do is, don't just do something, stand there and think what the right course of action is. I think more profoundly, there's a really interesting couple of challenges for people, both in our line of work and also more broadly in the economy. And I think, as I alluded to before, the introduction of technology and its use within our industry, it's at its earlier stages, but it's going to be profound. And I think we're yet to work out fully what that will mean. It is the kind of buzzword of the moment, but what does AI mean for our industry? That's yet to work through in any meaningful sense. I think there are also challenges around what the younger generations want. And as we think about growing our business over the medium and longer term, how do we attract and retain really good people? The things which I wanted out of life and my career 20, 25 years ago are very different, as I say, to what equivalently aged people may want today. And we need to think about that and not simply judge it as being different and therefore wrong. We need to innovate and evolve our offering to make sure that we remain relevant to younger potential members of staff, as well as remaining relevant to our clients in the same way that we have done for many, many years.
I think that's a good point, and it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, doesn't it, about going through the education process and giving people proper structured advice around careers and what the future looks like, which is the one thing that is very difficult to be able to guess at the moment, isn't it? So you talked quite a bit through the podcast today around people and the impact that people have had on you, particularly when you started your career as well, and how looking at where you are with Eleanor as a business partner, and again that was a connection that you made. So talk me through this importance of networking or connecting or building relationships, and how essential is it, and when should people start doing it?
I think in the modern environment, just as it has been for many years, networking is fundamental to success in professional services. Simply being clever, I don't think has ever been enough in and of itself in order to have a fully rounded, successful career in professional services, whether that's in law, architecture, accountancy, corporate finance, surveying, whatever it may be. I think you do need to have the ability to interact with people, because they are all team sports. They are not individual pursuits. I don't think you can start early enough, frankly. I don't think there's a too early option into that. I think you do have to be quite measured about it. And I think you have to recognize that the earlier years of your career, you won't be making much of an impact with the networking initiatives that you undertake and the work that you do. But often the relationships you forge in those early years are the ones which will see the test of time. And, if you are, a bit lucky and a bit strategic about it, you'll end up in a situation where both you and the people who you started networking with when you were in your early 20s, you will all end up somewhere further up the tree, and you'll suddenly find you're in your 30s, 40s, 50s and 60s, and you'll have spent an awful long time together, and you'll be in some quite senior positions, and those relationships will be incredibly valuable to you. You will have shared history. You will have, credibility with one another, which simply doesn't exist if you were in your 20s and you were trying to knock on the door of somebody who you've never met before and you never spent any time with. So I don't think it hurts to get good at those skills. I think they are skills which are learned. They're not skills which are embedded in people at birth. I think you can develop and you can hone them over time, and it's important that people invest in that.
I think that's a really good point as well, because I think lots of people, you talk about networking and people just envisage walking into a room where they don't know anybody and everybody knows everybody else, and they'll feel really uncomfortable. And I think if you can just pivot it a little bit and think it's about building relationships and being able to have conversations and listen to people, then I think it it really is, makes it seem a lot more achievable, doesn't it?
It's an area in which traditionally the accountancy profession struggles. So I think the statistics and the research tell you that accountants are, as a breed and as a brand, amongst the people who are slowest to form networking, connection, relationships with people, but those relationships tend to be deeper and more enduring. So I think it is, to some extent, to type. And even you saying, Stan, walking into a room full of people you don't know, it's given me shivers down my spine. I can think of few things that are worse than that in life. It sounds like an absolutely awful experience, but you do have to develop a number of different strategies whereby you can get through those situations, and you can break them down into something which is much more manageable, because often you find yourself out of your comfort zone, but you need to try and develop a way of taking value out of those interactions, even if it's not standing there and wowing a room full of 100 people with your witty repartee.
I love that. I'm waiting for that one next time I see you. There you go.
Thank you.
And what about words of wisdom then? What words of wisdom would you give to anyone thinking about getting into corporate finance now, or breaking into the accountancy career?
I'm a dad, so I've learned that my supposed words of wisdom are worth absolutely nothing. They're definitely valued at cost by my children.
Well, other children won't. They'll take it.
Yeah.
Only right.
They'll take my cash, but not necessarily my wisdom, which is probably the right way around. What words of wisdom would I offer? I think, and I have to recognise that I'm hopefully still very much mid-flight in my career and my journey. So I'm not seeing down the sunset of it, I hope, and being able to really give anything other than a sort of, a viewpoint from, at the end of the first 9 holes. My experience so far has been that one of the best things you can do throughout your career and throughout your life is to invest in yourself. I know that mental health is an increasingly popularized term, and one that people are more familiar and more comfortable with talking about. And I think that's a really healthy thing. I think we need to recognize that this is a long-term game, and people are not born with all the tools that they need to be able to be successful. Taking the time to invest in yourself, not just in what are sometimes called hard skills, compared to soft skills. And I would dislike that distinction, because actually personally I find many of what are called the soft skills to be the hardest ones to develop. I think it's important that you take the time to build those within yourself, build resilience as well as technical capability, and that opportunity is something you should grab when it's available to you. I probably underexploited the opportunity to find mentors in the earlier years of my career, and looking back, I wish I had done more of that. I think there are an awful lot of people around all of us who have a lot to share, and we should try and benefit from that where we can. I think there's something incredibly uplifting and energizing about being surrounded by younger people in the workforce. So to anyone who's my age or older, I would also say, don't look at the people who are younger than you and think that they've got nothing to teach you. It is a two-way street.
That's a really good point. And I think, if you look at reverse mentoring now and how important that is, I think that's a really big step forward. And I think also sponsorship, the difference between mentoring and sponsorship, and being able to help and support and push other people forward, if you think and can see potential, is massive. But I love your words around resilience. I think the sooner you can build resilience in your life and in your career for both elements, that is a major building block that will help you and support you. And investing in yourself is such a good point, I think, particularly for your professional work life, but also for your health as well, and health and well-being, which is really important. So I have to say, Christian, thank you so much. It's been amazing talking to you.
Thank you.
Enjoyed it, and look forward to seeing you soon and hearing your witty repertoire.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much for your time, and really appreciate the conversation today.